Let's start out by asking Henry a question. As I browsed the website of the Stanford Archives, I was quite confused by the number of projects. In particular, I would have thought that all the Silicon Valley developed technologies would be under the Silicon Valley Archives, but some are separate projects. In particular, there's projects on the history of computing, on the history of microcomputers, on artificial intelligence. Henry, can you position the Silicon Valley Archives versus the other library collection projects at Stanford?
Yeah, sure I can. The Silicon Valley Archives began about 30 years ago as the Stanford and the Silicon Valley Project. And the idea was that by then it was clear something was going on around here that was sort of historically important, maybe. And we knew that we had some collections relating to it, but most of the collections we had were the papers of Stanford faculty, like Fred Terman, of course, that gave some context to Silicon Valley but weren't from Silicon Valley. They were all Stanford collections. And so we thought there was this vector that we could kind of follow from the strength that we already had in the papers that related to Stanford's history as it affected the region around it, to move along that vector out into the valley and begin collecting papers of companies and individuals there. So it began as a project. It was a project within the scope of my curatorial fiefdom, which is the history of science and technology generally. So I actually, as a curator, this may interest you, I deal with everything in the history of science and technology. So I deal with manuscripts, I deal with rare books, I deal with the Isaac Newton collection at Stanford, all periods and everything. So history of computing might mean the history of computing in a disciplinary sense, not necessarily restricted to Northern California. But the Silicon Valley Project was a specific effort to focus on what happened here historically, building on this strength that we already had in the Stanford collections. Interesting thing, at that time, so the early 1980s, there was a lot going on in the archival world. The archival world, the library world, was also discovering the fact that a lot had happened since World War II in science and technology generally. Yeah, I mean, there's a lag. There's a lag between when it happens and when the cultural historical institutions begin to realize that something has happened and they need to do something. So it was in the 1980s, the American Institute of Physics History Center, the IEEE History Center, the Charles Babbage Institute. These were all founded kind of around that time, some a little earlier, some a little later, and they were beginning to develop methodologies for figuring out what documentation means at a large installation like SLAC. Archivists have no idea, that's a new problem. And one of the things that came up at that time was the idea of documenting regional technical development. So Silicon Valley being one of the regions at that time, Route 128 was another one. Several of these projects started actually in different parts of the country. The Babbage Institute, when it went to the University of Minnesota, as I'm sure you all know, it started here. But when it went to the University of Minnesota, part of the reason for that was the strong historical computing industry in that part of the upper Northwest and the idea of documenting that region's role in the history of computing. So this all started, we started our Silicon Valley project. And 30 years later, I think we're the last standing regionally focused project, archival and documentation project like this. I was around when the project started 30 years ago. I was, and we'll talk, I think, a little later about our backgrounds and so forth. But that was sort of the context of it. And again, it's one project among probably a dozen different project areas that I work in to support history of science and technology. It's probably the largest area among all the different things that I do.